Ethan Blackridge rode into Hale Valley with foreclosure papers in his saddlebag and ice in his veins until a barefoot widow stood in his path, 5 terrified children clinging to her skirts, and spoke the words that would shatter everything he thought he knew about power. "You'll have to kill me first." He came to collect a debt. He never expected to find a home worth fighting for, a woman whose courage could melt a frozen heart, or children who would teach him that redemption doesn't come from contracts. It comes from love. Stay with me until the end of this story and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale of second chances has traveled. The Wyoming sun hammered down like God's own judgment as Ethan Blackridge guided his black stallion through the narrow mountain pass. Dust devils danced across the parched valley floor below, and the leather reins felt slick with sweat beneath his calloused palms. August 1887 had brought drought to the high country, turning green valleys into stretches of brittle grass that crackled underfoot like old parchment. Ethan had made this ride 100 times before, always for the same reason. Debt collection was a cold business, but someone had to do it. In 15 years of banking and land acquisition, he'd learned that mercy was expensive, and sentiment was a luxury men like him couldn't afford. The Blackridge name meant something in Wyoming territory. It meant power, prosperity, and the kind of influence that made territorial governors return his telegrams within the hour. It also meant he rode alone. The valley opened before him like a wounded thing, beautiful despite its suffering. Cottonwoods lined a creek that had shrunk to barely a trickle, their leaves already showing the yellow edge of early autumn stress. In the distance, a weathered homestead sat against the mountain's shadow, the Hale property, according to his records. 40 acres of struggling wheat, a barn that leaned dangerously to the east, and a debt 3 months overdue. Samuel Hale had borrowed $200 last spring to buy seed and livestock. The loan had come with standard terms, repayment by September 1st or foreclosure. It was now August 28th, and Ethan had received neither payment nor correspondence. The bank's letters had gone unanswered. Time had run out. Ethan touched the folded papers in his vest pocket, legal, proper, and utterly final. He felt nothing about it. Feeling was dangerous in his line of work. The homestead grew larger as his horse picked its way down the rocky trail. Up close, the place looked even worse than his initial assessment. The barn's roof was patched with mismatched boards. The corral fence held together with rope and prayer. A kitchen garden struggled valiantly beside the house, its plants drooping despite obvious recent watering. Someone was trying hard here. It wouldn't matter. Ethan had learned long ago that effort and outcome weren't related. The territory was littered with the dreams of people who'd tried hard and failed anyway. He was 50 yards from the house when the door opened. A woman stepped onto the porch, and Ethan's hand instinctively moved toward the rifle in his saddle scabbard before he registered that she wasn't armed. She was young, maybe 25, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun and a faded blue dress that had been mended so many times the original fabric was hard to distinguish from the patches. But it was her eyes that stopped him. They burned with something fierce and desperate, the look of a cornered animal that would bite rather than surrender. She didn't wait for him to speak. "I know who you are. I know why you're here. The answer is no." Ethan dismounted, moving with the deliberate calm of a man accustomed to hostile receptions. He looped his reins over the porch rail and removed his hat, more from habit than courtesy. "Mrs. Hale, I presume." "Widow Hale." Her voice was steady, but her hands were clenched in her skirts. "My husband died 4 months ago. Wagon accident on the pass." That explained the unanswered letters. Ethan felt a flicker of something, not quite sympathy, but an acknowledgement of bad timing. "I'm sorry for your loss. That doesn't change the situation. The loan came due September 1st. I'm here to discuss terms." "There are no terms to discuss." She lifted her chin, and he saw she was trembling. Not from fear, from rage barely contained. "This is my land, my home, my children's future. You can't have it." "The law disagrees." Ethan kept his voice level, professional. He'd had this conversation before in various forms. The outcome was always the same. "Your husband signed a contract. The debt survives him. A debt I can't pay because the man who could have helped me harvest died falling off a mountain. Her voice cracked, and she visibly fought for control. Do you know what it's like to watch your husband's body come home in pieces? To stand over a grave with 5 children asking when Papa's coming back? To realize that everything you've built together is going to be taken by a man in an expensive suit who's never worked a day of honest labor in his life? The accusation stung more than Ethan cared to admit. His hands had known hard work once before money and influence had softened them, before betrayal had taught him that trusting people was the fastest way to lose everything. My sympathies don't change economics, he said quietly. I didn't write the contract. I'm just here to enforce it. Then you're here to steal from a widow and orphans. She stepped down from the porch and he saw she was barefoot, her feet dusty from the yard. That makes you a thief in fine clothing. Before Ethan could respond, the door burst open and children spilled onto the porch like a small avalanche. 5 of them, ranging from maybe 3 to 12 years old, all wide-eyed and frightened. They clustered behind their mother, hands grabbing at her skirts, faces pressed against her sides. The oldest was a girl, tall and gangly, with her mother's fierce eyes. The youngest was a boy, barely more than a baby, with tears already streaming down his dirt-smudged face. Between them were 3 others, 2 more girls and a boy, all staring at Ethan like he was the devil himself come to call. Go inside, Lydia said softly, not taking her eyes off Ethan. Mama, who is he? The oldest girl asked. No one important. Go inside. Mama? Sarah? Inside. Now. The command was gentle but absolute. The children hesitated, then slowly retreated, though Ethan could see faces pressed against the windows, watching. Lydia waited until the door closed, then turned back to him. You came for a debt. Here it is, 5 children who need a roof over their heads. A wheat field ready to harvest that could bring in enough money to pay you back with interest. A woman who's worked herself half to death trying to save what her husband built. That's what you're foreclosing on. That's what your contract is worth. Ethan looked past her at the field she'd mentioned. The wheat was indeed ready, golden and heavy-headed, probably 3 weeks from combining. In a normal year, 40 acres of good wheat could bring in $400, maybe more, enough to pay the debt twice over. But harvest took labor, equipment, and time, all things a widow alone couldn't provide. The wheat won't harvest itself, he said. You'd need a crew, a combine, wagons to get it to market. Even if you had the money to hire help, which you don't, there's not enough time before the bank note comes due. Then give me time. She stepped closer, and he smelled wood smoke and sweat and something floral, lavender maybe, from the soap she used. Give me until the harvest is in. 1 month, 6 weeks at most. I'll pay every cent with interest. That's not how contracts work. Damn your contracts! The profanity shocked him coming from her. It clearly shocked her too, but she didn't back down. I'm begging you, not as a debtor, but as a mother. Give my children a chance. Ethan had been in this position before. Desperate people said desperate things. If he bent the rules once, word would spread, and every debtor in Wyoming would come looking for mercy. His reputation, his power, rested on consistency, on being unmovable. He pulled the foreclosure papers from his pocket. Mrs. Hale, this isn't personal, it's business. The property reverts to the bank as of September 1st. You have 4 days to vacate. I can arrange transportation to Laramie if you need assistance. Transportation? She laughed, a bitter sound. How generous. Tell me, Mr. Blackridge, where exactly do you think a penniless widow with 5 children should go? What do you imagine happens to us after you take our home? He'd never thought about it. After foreclosure, people simply left, went somewhere else. It wasn't his concern what happened next, but looking at this woman, at the faces pressed against the windows, he found himself wondering for the first time. Where did they go? How did they survive? The territory had no shortage of desperate people, and winters were brutal. Children died in the cold every year. There are charitable organizations, he said, knowing how hollow it sounded. The church runs on goodwill and thin soup. You know what happens to families like mine? We get split up. The older children get sent to work as labor. The younger ones go to orphanages if we're lucky, or we end up on the street if we're not. I've seen it happen. I won't let it happen to us. Then you should have thought about that before your husband borrowed money he couldn't repay. The slap came fast, cracking across his face before he could move. His cheek burned and the papers fluttered from his hand. They stood frozen, both shocked by what she'd done. "Get off my land," Lydia whispered, her hand still raised, trembling. "Get off my land before I get my husband's rifle and make you leave." Ethan bent slowly and retrieved the papers. His face throbbed, and he could taste blood where his teeth had cut his lip. No one had struck him in 15 years. No one would have dared. He should call the sheriff, have her arrested for assault, accelerate the foreclosure. Instead, he found himself looking at her, really looking. At the desperation in her eyes, yes, but also the determination. The way she stood planted between him and her children like a human wall. The bare feet that spoke of poverty so deep she couldn't afford shoes. The mended dress. The calluses on her hands visible even from a distance. This woman was fighting a war she couldn't win, and she knew it, and she was fighting anyway. 7 days, he heard himself say. She blinked. What? 7 days, 1 week. Harvest your wheat, sell it at market, bring me payment in full. September 4th instead of September 1st. The words came out before he could stop them, before reason could override the impulse. That's my offer. Why would you do that? Ethan didn't have an answer. It was stupid, soft, exactly the kind of sentiment his father had beaten out of him as a boy. Mercy was weakness. Compassion was a luxury for people who could afford it. I don't know, he admitted. Maybe I'm having a moment of temporary insanity. Maybe I want to see if you're as stubborn as you appear. It doesn't matter. 7 days, Mrs. Hale. After that, the foreclosure proceeds whether the harvest is in or not. And if you try to run, I'll hunt you down and file charges for debt evasion. Are we clear? She was staring at him like he'd sprouted wings. 7 days. That's what I said. And if I can pay, then the debt is satisfied and the property remains yours. If you can't, you're out on September 4th instead of September 1st. 3 extra days to figure out where you're going. He turned back to his horse, suddenly needing distance from her, from this place, from the decision he'd just made. I'll be back in a week. Wait. Her voice stopped him with his foot in the stirrup. Why? Ethan looked back at her, at the children still pressed against the windows, at the wheat field golden in the afternoon sun. I don't know, he said again. Maybe your stubborn refusal to give up is contagious. Maybe I'm curious to see if you can actually pull this off, or maybe I'm just tired of being the villain in everyone's story. He mounted and turned his horse toward the trail. Behind him, he heard her call out, Mr. Blackridge? He paused but didn't look back. Thank you. The words were quiet but clear. Ethan urged his horse forward without responding. Gratitude made him uncomfortable. It implied obligation, connection, the possibility that he'd done something good instead of just temporarily postponing something bad. As he rode back up the mountain trail, the papers in his pocket felt heavier than before. 7 days. What had he been thinking? By this time next week, he'd be right back here, and she'd have failed, and he'd have to follow through on the foreclosure anyway. The only difference was he'd given her false hope in the meantime, unless she succeeded. The thought caught him off guard. Could she actually do it? Harvest 40 acres alone in a week? It was impossible. It would take a crew of 6 men 3 days minimum, and that was with proper equipment. She had none of that, but she had desperation, determination, and 5 children to protect. He'd learned in business that desperation made people capable of extraordinary things, usually desperate, stupid things, but extraordinary nonetheless. Behind him, the valley fell away. Ahead, the mountain pass waited, and beyond that, his hotel room in Milford, his office, his ledgers full of other people's debts, the life he'd built on being unmovable, uncompromising, and utterly alone. His cheek still burned where she'd slapped him shut. Lydia watched the man on the black horse disappear into the mountain pass, then collapsed onto the porch steps, her legs suddenly unable to hold her weight. Her heart hammered so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. 7 days. She'd been given 7 days to perform a miracle. The door creaked open and small bodies tumbled out around her. Sarah, her oldest at 12, sat down beside her and took her hand. Mama, who was that man? The banker. Lydia's voice sounded distant to her own ears. The one Papa borrowed money from. Is he taking our house? Not yet. He gave us a week. If we can get the harvest in and sell it, we keep the farm. How? This from Jacob, her 9-year-old, practical like his father. Papa said it takes 6 men to bring in wheat. We're just us. Then we'll figure out how to be 6 men. Lydia stood, brushing dust from her dress, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. We have 7 days. That's enough time if we work smart. Mama, your face is white. Emma, age 7, tugged at her sleeve. Are you sick? No, baby. I'm just thinking. She gathered the youngest 2, Emma and 5-year-old Rebecca, against her sides. Listen, all of you. This is going to be hard. Harder than anything we've done. But we're Hales, and Hales don't quit. Your papa didn't quit when the first winter nearly killed us. I'm not quitting now. Are you with me? Yes, Mama, they chorused, though she could see fear in their eyes. Good. Sarah, you're in charge of cooking and watching the little ones. Jacob, you're working the field with me. Martha, she looked at her middle child, age 10, quiet and steady. You're managing water and supplies. Everyone has a job. Everyone matters. Understood? More nods. Lydia pulled them close, breathing in the smell of sun-warmed hair and childhood sweat. 7 days ago, she'd stood over Samuel's grave and wondered how she'd survive the next 7 hours. Now she had to survive the next 7 days and pull off something impossible. She thought of Blackridge's face when she'd slapped him, the shock, the flash of anger, then something else she couldn't quite name. He could have had her arrested, could have called the sheriff and taken the children right then. Instead, he'd given her time. Why? The question bothered her more than she wanted to admit. Men like Blackridge didn't give widows extensions out of kindness. They didn't deviate from their contracts. They certainly didn't ride away from situations where they held all the power, unless there was something in it for them. The thought sent ice down her spine. What if this was a trap? What if he was giving her just enough rope to hang herself with, letting her fail publicly so the foreclosure would seem justified? Mama? Sarah's voice cut through her spiral. What do we do first? Lydia shook off the paranoia. It didn't matter what Blackridge's motivations were. She had 7 days and 40 acres of wheat. Everything else was noise. First we eat, then we plan, then at first light, we start cutting. Ethan made it back to Milford by dusk, his mind still churning with the day's events. The town was small but prosperous, a railroad stop that serviced the mining camps in the mountains. His hotel was the finest building on the main street, 3 stories of imported brick and glass that announced wealth and permanence. His room on the top floor was Spartan despite its expensive furnishings. A bed he rarely used, a desk buried in paperwork, a window that looked out over nothing he cared about. Home was too strong a word. This was just a place he occupied between business trips. He poured whiskey from a crystal decanter and stood at the window, watching the street below empty as darkness fell. Somewhere out there in the valley, a widow and 5 children were planning the impossible. He should feel nothing about it, satisfaction at extending basic decency, perhaps, or irritation at his own weakness. Instead, he felt curious. The curiosity was dangerous. Ethan had built his fortune on emotional distance, on seeing people as numbers on a ledger rather than individuals with stories. The moment you started caring about their circumstances was the moment you stopped making profitable decisions. He'd learned that lesson the hard way. His hand unconsciously moved to the scar on his ribs, hidden beneath his vest. A reminder of what trust cost, of what happened when you let someone past your defenses and mistook business for friendship. Thomas Westfield had been his partner once, his best friend, the brother he'd never had. They'd built Blackridge and Westfield together from nothing. Then Thomas had emptied their accounts and disappeared with Ethan's fiancée, leaving him with debts, devastation, and a lesson carved into his flesh. Never trust, never soften, never let anyone matter enough to hurt you. That was 12 years ago. Since then, Ethan had rebuilt alone, made himself untouchable, became the man everyone feared and no one dared to cross. It was a lonely existence, but loneliness was safe. A barefoot widow with fierce eyes shouldn't be able to crack that foundation with a single slap and a desperate plea. But she had, and now he'd done something stupid. Ethan drank his whiskey and tried to convince himself that 7 days would change nothing. She'd fail, he'd foreclose, life would continue exactly as it had before. The fact that he was already wondering how she was planning her harvest strategy, whether the children had enough to eat, if she owned tools sharp enough for the work ahead, all of that was just idle curiosity. It meant nothing. He repeated that to himself until he almost believed it, then went to bed and dreamed of bare feet in the dust and children's faces pressed against windows, watching a stranger who held their future in his pocket. Dawn came too early. Lydia had barely slept, her mind racing through calculations that never quite added up. 40 acres. 7 days. 1 woman, 1 nearly grown girl, and 1 9-year-old boy. The math was impossible, but impossible was all she had to work with. She rose in the dark, built up the fire, and started coffee. The kitchen was small but efficient, designed by Samuel in the early days when they'd still believed they'd grow old together here. Every board, every nail, every window placement carried his fingerprints. Moving through the space felt like walking through a memory. "Don't think about him," she whispered to herself, hands steady as she measured coffee. "Think about the work." Sarah appeared in the doorway, already dressed, hair braided. "I couldn't sleep either." "You should try. You'll need your strength." "So will you." Sarah moved to the stove, taking over the coffee with practiced ease. "Mama, can we really do this?" Lydia wanted to lie, to offer false confidence and maternal certainty, but Sarah was 12, old enough for truth. "I don't know. The odds are bad, but the odds of surviving without this farm are worse, so we try anyway." "What if we fail?" "Then we fail fighting instead of giving up." "I can live with that." Sarah was quiet for a moment, then said, "I can work the field too. I'm strong enough." "You're needed here. The little ones can help each other. Martha's 10. She can manage. You need every hand you can get in that wheat." Sarah's voice was firm, adult in a way that broke Lydia's heart. Her daughter was growing up too fast, forced into maturity by circumstance. "Papa taught me to cut. I know what to do." Lydia studied her eldest child, seeing Samuel in the set of her jaw, the determination in her eyes. "All right, but the moment you're too tired to continue, you stop. No arguments." "Same goes for you." They smiled at each other, fragile but real, then turned to wake the household. By the time the sun crested the mountains, the Hale family stood at the edge of the wheat field, tools in hand. Lydia had 3 scythes, 2 full-sized and 1 cut down for Jacob's height. Sarah carried a rake for gathering the cut stalks. The younger children had been assigned to bring water and snacks, jobs that made them feel useful without putting them in danger. The wheat stretched before them, a golden sea rippling in the morning breeze, beautiful and abundant and completely overwhelming. "Where do we start?" Jacob asked. "The south corner. We work in rows, cutting low and clean. Sarah rakes it into piles for binding. We'll worry about hauling and threshing later. First priority is just getting it down." Lydia gripped her scythe, feeling the familiar weight. She'd helped Samuel with harvests before, but never led one, never carried the weight of sole responsibility. "Remember, steady rhythm. Don't overextend. Watch your feet. The wheat's been here all summer. It'll wait for careful work." She raised her scythe and swung. The blade cut through the stalks with a satisfying whisper, and the first armful fell. Then another, and another. Beside her, Sarah and Jacob found their rhythm, and the sound of 3 scythes moving through wheat filled the morning air. It was brutal work. Within an hour, Lydia's back ached. Within 2, her hands were blistering. The sun climbed higher, turning the field into a furnace. Sweat soaked through her dress, and dust coated every exposed inch of skin. Sarah's face was red with effort, Jacob moving with grim determination that reminded her painfully of his father. But the wheat fell. Row by row, armful by armful, the golden stalks surrendered to their blades. It was slow, desperately, impossibly slow, but it was progress. At noon, Martha brought bread and cheese and water drawn cold from the well. They collapsed in the shade of the cottonwoods, too exhausted to talk, gulping water that tasted like life itself. "How much have we done?" Sarah asked. Lydia looked back at the cut section, maybe half an acre, maybe less. "Enough to know we can do more. We need help." This from Jacob, practical and blunt. "Mama, we can't do 40 acres. Even if we work every hour of daylight, it's not enough. Then we'll work into the night. We'll figure it out. How? She didn't have an answer. The truth was, Jacob was right. They couldn't do this alone. But where could they find help? The neighboring ranchers were struggling with their own harvests. Hiring hands cost money she didn't have. The town was 10 miles away, and most men there worked for wages she couldn't afford to pay. "We'll think of something," she said, trying to sound certain. "After we rest, we keep cutting. That's all we can do." They worked until sunset, pushed through exhaustion into something beyond it, a numb determination that kept arms swinging and feet moving long after rational thought would have stopped. When darkness finally made continuing impossible, they'd managed perhaps 2 acres, maybe less. 2 acres down, 38 to go, 6 days left. Lydia did the math in her head as she stumbled toward the house, and the numbers laughed at her. At this pace, they'd need 20 days to finish. They had 6. Inside, the younger children had made dinner, simple and slightly burned, but hot and filling. They ate in exhausted silence, then fell into bed without bothering to wash. Lydia lay in the darkness, every muscle screaming, hands raw and bleeding beneath hastily wrapped bandages. Tomorrow, they'd have to work faster, cut cleaner, find efficiency where none seemed to exist. Tomorrow, they'd have to perform a miracle. She closed her eyes and prayed to a God she wasn't sure was listening anymore, prayed for strength and time, and something she couldn't quite name, maybe just the grace to keep going when going seemed impossible. Outside, the wheat whispered in the darkness, 40 acres of golden stalks that held her family's future in their swaying heads. The sound should have been comforting. Instead, it sounded like a countdown, each rustle marking another moment sliding toward September 4th, and the man who would return to claim what the law said was his. 7 days. Lydia fell asleep calculating impossible mathematics, dreaming of wheat that grew faster than it could be cut, of scythes that moved by themselves, of miracles that never quite came but stayed always just beyond reach, shimmering in the heat like water in the desert that vanished the moment you tried to touch it. The second day dawned with mockery, clear skies, perfect harvest weather, and bodies that could barely move. Lydia woke to find her hands had stiffened overnight into claws, the blisters from yesterday broken and weeping. Every muscle felt like it had been beaten with rocks. Beside her, Sarah whimpered in her sleep, and through the thin wall she could hear Jacob's labored breathing. They were broken, and the wheat didn't care. She forced herself upright, biting back a cry as her back protested. The sun was already painting the eastern mountains gold. They'd lost time sleeping. Every minute mattered now. Every hour was precious, and she'd wasted the cool morning darkness lying in bed like an invalid. The kitchen was cold. Martha sat at the table, already dressed, her young face grave. "Mama, Sarah can't lift her arms. Jacob's hands are bleeding through the bandages." "They'll heal." Lydia moved to the stove, her own hands shaking as she built up the fire. "We work anyway." "But, Mama, we work anyway." She said it louder than she meant to, harshness born of desperation. Martha flinched, and Lydia immediately softened. "I'm sorry, baby. I'm just tired. Wake the others. We need to start." By the time the family assembled in the pre-dawn light, Lydia had wrapped fresh bandages around her hands, and Sarah's used strips torn from an old sheet. Jacob's palms were raw meat, but he'd bound them himself and stood ready, jaw set in that stubborn way that was pure Samuel. They walked to the field like soldiers to battle, and the wheat waited, vast and unconquered, mocking their previous day's effort with its overwhelming abundance. "Same as yesterday," Lydia said, trying to inject confidence into her voice. "Steady and careful. We can do this." They worked for 3 hours before the sound of hoofbeats froze them mid-swing. Lydia's heart seized. It was too early. Blackridge had said 7 days, but it was only the second morning. Had he changed his mind? Come to accelerate the foreclosure? She turned, scythe still in hand, prepared to fight if necessary. But the rider coming down the mountain trail wasn't Ethan Blackridge. It was a boy, maybe 16, on a tired mule. He wore patched overalls and a hat 2 sizes too large, and he pulled up at the field's edge with a nervous expression. "Mrs. Hale?" "Who's asking?" "Name's Tommy Birch, ma'am. I work sometimes at the feed store in Milford. Mr. Blackridge sent me. Ice flooded Lydia's veins. What does he want? Nothing, ma'am. He didn't want nothing. He paid me $2 to come help with your harvest. Said you might need an extra set of hands. The boy gestured to the mule's pack. Brought my own scythe and some binding twine. Mr. Blackridge said I should work till the job's done or till you send me away, whichever comes first. Lydia stared at him, unable to process the words. Blackridge sent you? The banker? Yes, ma'am. I know it sounds strange. Seems strange to me too, but $2 is $2. And he said you were good people who deserved a fair chance. Tommy dismounted, pulling a well-worn scythe from his pack. So where do you want me to start? I don't understand. Lydia looked toward the mountain pass as if Blackridge might materialize to explain himself. Why would he do this? Didn't say, ma'am. Just gave me the money and the directions and told me not to come back till the wheat was in or you told me to leave. Tommy studied the field, then her exhausted children. Looks like you could use the help, if you're willing to have me. Sarah and Jacob were watching their mother, waiting for direction. Lydia's mind raced. This had to be a trick. Men like Blackridge didn't help widows out of kindness. There had to be an angle, a trap, something she wasn't seeing, but her hands were bleeding, her children were broken, and the wheat wouldn't wait for her to unravel Blackridge's motivations. South corner, she said finally. Work alongside Jacob. Match his rhythm so you don't get in each other's way. Tommy grinned, relieved. Yes, ma'am. You won't regret this. She already regretted it, but not for the reasons he thought. Accepting help from Blackridge felt like accepting chains, like acknowledging a debt that went beyond money into territory she didn't understand and couldn't control. But the wheat was falling faster now, with Tommy's strong young back adding to their efforts, and desperation made philosophers of no one. She swallowed her pride and swung her scythe, and tried not to think about what favors might be called in later. They worked until noon, and the difference was remarkable. What would have taken them all day took only the morning. 3 acres down by lunchtime, the rhythm of 4 scythes creating a steady music that actually sounded like progress. Over bread and water, Tommy proved talkative, filling the exhausted silence with easy chatter about Milford, the feed store, his family's struggles with their own small farm. He was kind to the younger children, making them laugh with silly faces, and he worked without complaint even when the afternoon heat turned savage. By sunset, they'd managed 6 acres total. Still nowhere near enough, but better than yesterday. Possible instead of impossible. As darkness fell and they trudged back to the house, Tommy unsaddled his mule and bedded down in the barn without being asked. I'll be up at dawn, Mrs. Hale. We'll do even better tomorrow. Lydia wanted to ask him again why Blackridge had sent him, what the banker expected in return, whether this was kindness or strategy or something else entirely. But Tommy had already disappeared into the barn, and her children needed feeding, and exhaustion was pulling at her like an undertow. Inside, while Martha heated stew and the little ones washed in the basin, Sarah pulled her mother aside. Mama, why would Mr. Blackridge help us? What does he want? I don't know, baby. Are you scared? Lydia looked at her daughter's face, so much older than 12 had any right to be. Yes, but I'm more scared of losing this place, so we accept the help and stay alert, and we'll deal with whatever comes after, when it comes. That night, Lydia lay awake long after the house quieted, listening to the sound of Tommy's breathing in the barn, to the wheat rustling outside, to the beat of her own heart counting down the days. 4.5 days left, 34 acres remaining. The math was still brutal, but it had shifted from impossible to merely improbable. And somewhere in Milford, a banker who should have been her enemy had done something inexplicably kind. The thought kept her awake until nearly midnight, turning the puzzle over and over, examining it from every angle, finding no answers that satisfied. 3 miles away in his hotel room, Ethan Blackridge stood at his window and wondered the same thing. Why had he sent the Birch boy? It was a stupid gesture, one that could be interpreted as weakness, that might encourage other debtors to ask for similar accommodations. His reputation as an unmovable force was his greatest asset. Gestures like this eroded it, but he'd woken that morning thinking about a barefoot widow swinging a scythe with blistered hands, about children too young to understand debt and foreclosure and the brutal mathematics of poverty. He'd calculated how many acres one woman and 2 children could reasonably harvest in 6 days and came up with a number that made the 7-day extension meaningless. So he'd found Tommy Birch, a good kid who needed work, and paid him out of his own pocket, not the bank's, his own, to ride out to the valley and help. It wasn't mercy, he told himself. It was just leveling the field, making the contest fair, giving her an actual chance instead of a false one. The rationalization felt hollow, even as he constructed it. The truth, which he barely admitted to himself, was that something about Lydia Hale had gotten under his skin. The fierce eyes. The slap that still burned in his memory. The way she'd stood barefoot between him and her children, like she could physically stop a foreclosure through will alone. He'd spent 12 years making sure nothing and no one could touch him, and this widow had managed it in 10 minutes. Dangerous. That's what this was. Dangerous and stupid, and exactly the kind of emotional entanglement that destroyed men in his position. He should ride back out tomorrow, call the whole thing off, proceed with the foreclosure, and be done with it. Cut his losses before the situation got more complicated. Instead, he found himself calculating grain prices and harvest yields, wondering if 40 acres of good wheat would actually bring in enough to cover the debt, whether the Milford grain merchant would give a fair price to a desperate widow, what other obstacles might stand between Lydia Hale and saving her home. Planning, like he was on her side instead of the bank's. Ethan poured another whiskey and forced himself to review other accounts, other debts, other business that should have occupied his attention. But the numbers swam before his eyes, refusing to coalesce into meaning. And eventually he gave up and went to bed, where he dreamed of wheat fields and bare feet and fierce dark eyes that saw through all his carefully constructed armor straight to the lonely man beneath. Morning came faster than either of them wanted, bringing the third day and all its demands. Lydia woke to find Tommy already in the field, working in the gray pre-dawn light. The boy had dedication. She'd give him that. Or maybe Blackridge was paying him well enough to inspire it. Either way, she felt a flicker of something almost like hope as she roused her household and they stumbled out to join him. The rhythm was better now, their bodies adjusting to the brutality despite the pain. Sarah worked with fierce determination. Jacob matched Tommy's pace with competitive pride, and even Martha helped by managing the binding, tying cut wheat into bundles that could be easily hauled. They were actually making progress. Real, measurable progress. By mid-morning, they'd cleared another 2 acres, and the pile of bundled wheat beside the barn was growing into something substantial. Not enough yet, not nearly enough, but visible. Tangible. Possible. That's when the second rider appeared. This time, Lydia's stomach didn't drop with fear. She was too exhausted for fear, too focused on the work to spare energy for dread. She barely looked up from her scythe as the horse approached. "Mrs. Hale?" The voice was familiar, and she straightened to find Ethan Blackridge dismounting at the field's edge. He wasn't dressed for business today. No suit, just simple work clothes, leather vest, dusty boots. He looked younger somehow, less severe. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "You own the interruption, Mr. Blackridge, or will in a few days." She wiped sweat from her forehead with her bandaged hand. "Come to check on your investment?" "Something like that." He studied the field, the cut acres, the bundled wheat. "You're making good progress. Thanks to the help you sent, though I'm still waiting to hear what that generosity costs me." "It doesn't cost you anything." He said it simply, like it was obvious, and it infuriated her. Nothing's free, especially not from bankers. Sometimes things are exactly what they appear to be. A widow needed help. I sent help. That's the entire transaction. Lydia wanted to argue, to push back against the notion that he could be that simple, that kind. But her hands hurt, her back screamed, and she had 32 acres of wheat still standing. She didn't have energy for philosophy. "Why are you here then? If not to check on me, why ride all the way out?" Ethan removed his vest, folding it carefully over his saddle. He picked up a spare scythe leaning against the fence. "I'm here to work." "Excuse me?" "You heard me." He tested the blade's edge with his thumb, nodded approval. "You need more hands. I have 2. "Where do you want me?" "You're joking." "Do I look like I'm joking?" He didn't. He looked serious, determined, and completely insane. Lydia stared at him, searching for the trap, the angle, the hidden blade in this offer. "You're a banker. You don't do field work." "I was a farmer's son before I was a banker. I know which end of the scythe to hold." He walked toward the uncut wheat, testing his grip. "Are you going to stand there arguing, or are you going to show me where to start?" "This is insane." "Probably. But your wheat doesn't care about my sanity. It cares about getting cut before September 4th. Now, are you going to put me to work, or do I just start swinging and hope for the best?" Sarah and Jacob had stopped working to watch this exchange, mouths open. Tommy looked equally baffled. Even the younger children had emerged from the house, drawn by the commotion. Lydia felt the whole situation tilting into territory she didn't understand. This man was supposed to be her enemy, the person taking her home, the face of heartless business and legal inevitability. He wasn't supposed to show up in work clothes and offer to swing a scythe like some kind of frontier good Samaritan. "Why?" she asked again, needing an answer that made sense. "Just tell me why." Ethan turned to face her fully, and for a moment his carefully constructed neutrality cracked. She saw something raw beneath, loneliness maybe, or regret, or just the exhaustion of being the villain in every story. "Because I gave you 7 days, and I meant for them to be 7 real days, not 7 impossible days. Because watching people fight losing battles is only entertaining when the battle isn't rigged from the start. Because," he hesitated, then shrugged, "because I can, and you need it, and maybe that's reason enough." It wasn't reason enough. It didn't explain anything. But his hands were already on the scythe, and he was moving toward the wheat, and Lydia was too tired to keep arguing with someone who seemed determined to help her whether she understood it or not. "Northwest corner," she said finally. "Work between Tommy and the fence line. Keep your spacing so you don't hit each other. And Blackridge?" He paused, looking back. "You slow us down. You're fired." He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his severe face into something almost warm. "Understood, ma'am." And then Ethan Blackridge, cattle baron and banker, one of the most powerful men in Wyoming territory, began swinging a scythe through wheat like he'd been born to it. Which, Lydia realized as she watched him work, maybe he had been. His form was perfect, smooth, efficient, the motion of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. He kept pace with Tommy easily, his cuts clean and low, wasting nothing. Whatever else he was, the man knew how to harvest wheat. They worked through the morning without speaking, the field filling with the whisper song of 5 scythes moving through golden stalks. The sun climbed higher, turned vicious, and still they worked. Lydia found herself falling into rhythm with Blackridge without meaning to, their blades moving in counterpoint, his speed pushing her to keep up, her determination making him work harder. It felt like competition and cooperation all mixed together, like fighting and dancing at the same time. At noon, Martha brought food and water to the field instead of making them stop. They ate standing, gulping water between bites, no one willing to lose momentum. Lydia noticed Blackridge's hands were blistering despite his obvious experience, the soft life of banking having stripped away whatever calluses farming had built. "You're bleeding," she said, nodding at his palms. He glanced down, almost surprised. "So are you." "I don't have a choice." "Neither do I. Not anymore." He wrapped his hands with strips of cloth from his saddlebag and went back to the wheat before she could ask what he meant. They finished 8 more acres by sunset, their best day yet. 15 acres total cut, 25 remaining, 3.5 days left. The mathematics were finally starting to bend toward possible. As darkness forced them to stop, Ethan walked his horse toward the barn, moving like a man who'd discovered muscles he'd forgotten he owned. Lydia intercepted him at the corral. "You're coming back tomorrow." It wasn't a question, but he answered anyway. "Unless you're firing me." "I don't understand you." "That makes 2 of us." He swung into the saddle with a barely suppressed groan. "I'll be here at dawn. Try to get some sleep, Mrs. Hale. Tomorrow will be harder than today." "That's impossible." "That seems to be our specialty lately, doing impossible things." He touched his hat brim in something between goodbye and salute, then rode toward the mountain pass, disappearing into the gathering dark. Lydia stood watching long after he'd vanished, her mind spinning. She should be grateful, she supposed. Suspicious, certainly. But mostly, she just felt confused by a banker who worked like a farmer, who paid teenage boys to help widows, who showed up day after day to swing a scythe in killing heat for no apparent reason beyond the fact that he could. Men like that didn't exist in her experience. Men like that were fairy tales, and fairy tales didn't appear during foreclosures with bleeding hands and knowing smiles. Inside the house, Sarah was already asleep at the table, head pillowed on her arms. Jacob had collapsed onto his bed without undressing. The younger children were scattered like dropped puppets, exhaustion having claimed them wherever they'd landed. Lydia should wake them, make them wash and eat properly. Instead, she covered each with whatever blanket she could find and let them sleep. Tomorrow would demand everything they had. Tonight, rest was the only mercy available. She lay down herself still fully dressed, her body a symphony of pain, and closed her eyes on the third day of 7, on the mystery of a banker who harvested wheat, on the impossible mathematics that were slowly, inexplicably, beginning to add up to something that might resemble hope. If hope could hurt this much. If hope came with bleeding hands and a stranger's incomprehensible kindness. If hope looked like Ethan Blackridge riding away into darkness after spending all day helping to save a home he technically still intended to foreclose on. The contradictions spun through her exhausted mind until sleep finally claimed her, pulling her down into dreams where wheat grew to the sky and hands that bled turned gold when they touched the harvest. And a man in dusty work clothes smiled at her like she was worth saving, even though she'd slapped him once and understood nothing about why he kept coming back. The fourth day began with thunder rolling through the mountains like a warning from God himself. Lydia woke to the sound, and her heart sank. Rain would turn the wheat field into mud, make cutting impossible, ruin everything they'd harvested that wasn't yet under cover. She rushed to the window and saw dark clouds massing over the peaks, moving fast toward the valley. They had maybe 2 hours before the storm hit. "Everyone up!" She was already dressed, already moving. "We work until the rain comes. Move!" The household erupted into motion. Within minutes, they were racing toward the field, Tommy stumbling from the barn half asleep, and then Blackridge appeared on the trail, riding hard, clearly having seen the same storm and reached the same conclusion. He dismounted at a run. "How much can we get under cover?" "The bundled wheat's safe in the barn. Everything else—" Lydia gestured at the 25 acres still standing, helpless. "Then we cut until we can't." Ethan grabbed his scythe, already moving. "And we pray the storm passes fast." They worked with desperate speed, racing against the sky. The clouds rolled closer, turning morning into premature twilight. Wind picked up, making the wheat dance and bend, making every swing of the scythe feel like fighting the air itself. Thunder crashed overhead, and the first fat drops began to fall. "Keep going," Lydia shouted over the rising wind. "Every stalk counts." The rain came in earnest then, not a gentle shower but a deluge that turned the world gray and made visibility vanish beyond a few yards. The field became treacherous, mud sucking at their feet, the wheat slick and hard to grip. But they kept swinging, kept cutting, kept moving through the downpour like madmen who refused to acknowledge defeat. Lightning split the sky close enough that Lydia felt the hair on her arms stand up. Blackridge grabbed her shoulder, pulling her toward the barn. "Inside, it's not worth dying for. The wheat will still be here when the storm passes. Move!" He was shouting now, physically pushing her toward shelter. Sarah had already gotten the younger children inside. Tommy and Jacob came running, and then they were all in the barn, soaked to the skin, breathing hard, watching the rain hammer down like judgment. The storm raged for 3 hours. 3 hours of precious daylight lost, of work they couldn't do, of time bleeding away. They sat in the hay and watched the field turn into a lake, watched their hopes literally wash away, and no one spoke because there was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like surrender. When the rain finally stopped, the damage was clear. The wheat they'd cut but not yet bundled was flattened, ruined. The standing wheat was beaten down, stalks broken and tangled. What should have been straightforward harvest had become a nightmare of salvage work. Lydia walked out into the devastation and wanted to scream. 4 days of brutal work? And now this. The mathematics that had finally started to make sense had just become impossible again. "We can still do this." Blackridge's voice was quiet but firm behind her. "It's harder now, but not impossible." "You can't know that." I grew up farming. I've seen storms like this. The wheat's not destroyed, just complicated. We work slower, more carefully, separate the salvageable from the ruined. It takes longer, but it's doable. We don't have longer. We have 2.5 days left. She turned to face him, and something in her finally broke. Why are you even here? Why do you keep coming back? Is this entertainment for you? Watching me fail in slow motion? He flinched like she'd slapped him again. You think I'm enjoying this? I don't know what to think. Nothing about you makes sense. You're supposed to be the enemy, but you're here swinging a scythe and sending help and acting like you actually care whether we succeed, and I don't understand why. The words poured out, sharp with exhaustion and confusion and fear. What do you want from me? What's this really about? Ethan was quiet for a long moment, rain dripping from his hair, his face unreadable. Then he said, I want to see you win. Why? Because everyone deserves at least one person in their corner. Because your children deserve better than watching their mother get crushed by circumstances she didn't create. Because you stood barefoot in the dirt and refused to surrender. And that kind of courage should mean something. His voice was rough, raw with emotion he usually kept buried. Because maybe I'm tired of being the villain. Maybe I'm tired of taking things from people who have nothing left to lose. Maybe for once in my miserable calculating life, I want to be on the side that deserves to win. Lydia stared at him, at this man who made no sense, who kept cracking open in ways she didn't expect. I slapped you. I deserved it. I called you a thief. That wasn't inaccurate. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. You were protecting your children. I was threatening their home. You had every right to rage at me. And now you're trying to help save what you came to take. That's insane. Yes, it is. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the vulnerability he tried so hard to hide. But I've spent 12 years being perfectly sane and perfectly alone, and it turns out sanity is overrated. So here I am, Mrs. Hale, in your corner whether you understand it or not. The question is, are you going to stand here arguing with me about my motivations, or are you going to let me help you save your home? She wanted to keep fighting, wanted to push back against this impossible kindness until it made sense, or broke, or revealed itself as the trap she kept expecting. But the wheat was drowning in mud, and time was running out, and she was so tired of fighting everything alone. The north section, she said finally. That's where the damage is worst. If we can salvage half of it, we might still have enough. Relief flickered across his face. Then that's where we start. They returned to the field, to the mess the storm had made, and began the painstaking work of sorting damaged wheat from salvageable stalks. It was slower than cutting virgin wheat, more tedious, harder on already exhausted bodies. But they worked, and gradually order emerged from chaos. Sarah and Jacob joined them, Tommy too, and together they worked through the afternoon salvaging what they could. The bundled wheat was measured and counted. 30 wagon loads, give or take, enough to bring maybe $300 at market if they got a fair price. They needed at least $200 to clear the debt. It was close, desperately, impossibly close. As sunset painted the mountains gold, a rider appeared on the trail. Not one of them recognized him at first. A broad man in a deputy's badge riding with the kind of authority that made everyone nervous. That's Warren Cole, Blackridge said quietly, his voice suddenly tense. Deputy from Milford. This isn't good. Cole dismounted at the field's edge, his eyes sweeping over the scene with obvious disapproval. Ethan Blackridge. Didn't expect to find you playing farmhand. Deputy? Ethan's voice had gone cold, professional. What brings you out here? Concerned citizens. Cole's gaze moved to Lydia, assessing and unfriendly. There's been talk in town, Mrs. Hale. Talk about your situation here. People are concerned about the welfare of your children. Ice flooded Lydia's veins. What talk? About a widow living alone with 5 children and no means of support. About questionable company keeping. His eyes flicked meaningfully between Lydia and Ethan. About children working in dangerous conditions without proper supervision. My children are fine. Lydia moved to stand between Cole and her family, an echo of that first day with Blackridge. They're fed, clothed, and loved. We're managing. Are you? Cole gestured at the muddy field, the exhausted children, the wreckage of the storm. From where I stand, you're failing, forcing children to do adult labor, living in questionable circumstances with a man who isn't your husband. That's grounds for intervention, Mrs. Hale. Intervention. The word tasted like poison. Lydia knew what that meant. The county taking her children, placing them in homes or institutions, tearing her family apart in the name of their own welfare. You can't. I can, and I will, if circumstances warrant. Cole pulled papers from his vest. I'm authorized to remove children from unsafe living situations. The county judge agrees that your circumstances raise concerns. On whose complaint? Blackridge's voice cut like a blade. Who filed against Mrs. Hale? That's confidential. It's Martha Gaines, isn't it? That bitter old gossip who runs the boarding house. Ethan's face was hard as stone. She's been after this land for years, wants to expand her property. This is a land grab dressed up as civic concern. The source of the complaint doesn't change the facts. A widow, alone, struggling to provide, entertaining male visitors without proper chaperone. Cole's smile was oily. A judge might rule that the children would be better served in more stable circumstances. Lydia felt the world tilting. After everything, the work, the hope, the impossible progress, they were going to lose anyway. Not to foreclosure, but to gossip and cruelty and laws designed to punish women who didn't fit proper society's narrow definitions. The children stay with their mother. Blackridge stepped forward, and something in his voice made even Cole pause. There's no impropriety here, Deputy. Mrs. Hale has help harvesting her wheat, paid help, entirely proper. I'm here in a business capacity, nothing more. Business that keeps you here dawn to dark? That has you working her fields like some kind of hired hand? Forgive me if I find that unconvincing. Then let me make it more convincing. Ethan's words came slowly, deliberately, like he was making a decision in real time. Mrs. Hale and I are engaged to be married. The banns will be posted this week. That makes my presence here not just appropriate, but expected. A man helping his future wife and children is hardly scandalous. The silence that followed was absolute. Lydia couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Cole looked skeptical, Tommy openly shocked. Sarah's eyes were wide as dinner plates. Engaged. Cole's tone dripped disbelief. How convenient. Convenient or not, it's true. Blackridge moved to stand beside Lydia, close enough that shoulders nearly touched. Any objection to my helping my fiancée save her property? I'd want proof. A woman in Mrs. Hale's position might say anything to keep her children. Then we'll marry now, today, tomorrow at the latest. Ethan turned to Lydia, and his eyes asked a question his mouth couldn't speak aloud. A desperate, impossible question that changed everything. Unless my bride has objections? Lydia's mind reeled. This was insane. Marriage? To a man she barely knew? To the banker who'd come to foreclose on her home? It was a lie, a fiction to satisfy a deputy and save her children, and it would never work. Except Cole was already backing down, his legal grounds crumbling, and her children were watching with hope breaking across their exhausted faces. And Ethan Blackridge was looking at her like she was worth fighting for, like this impossible gesture meant something more than just legal maneuvering. No objections, she heard herself say. We're engaged. We'll marry as soon as it can be arranged. Cole's jaw tightened. I'll be watching, Mrs. Hale. Watching very closely. Any hint that this is a sham, any suggestion you're not providing proper care, and I'll be back with the judge's order. Are we clear? Crystal clear. Ethan's voice could have cut glass. Now get off her property. You've delivered your warning. Your business here is done. Cole mounted his horse with poor grace, shooting them both looks that promised future trouble. Congratulations on your engagement. I hope it's everything you deserve. He rode off toward Milford, and the moment he disappeared over the pass, Lydia's legs gave out. She sat down hard in the mud, shaking so badly her teeth chattered. Sarah rushed to her side, and then all 5 children were there, pressed against her, their small bodies radiating fear and confusion. Mama? Sarah's voice was tiny. Are you really marrying Mr. Blackridge? Lydia looked up at Ethan, who stood apart, his face unreadable. I don't know. Ethan crouched down to the children's level, his voice gentle. Your mama and I said what we needed to say to keep you together. What happens next is between her and me. But I promise you this, no one is taking you away from your mother. Not Cole, not the county, not anyone. You have my word. But you said you were getting married. This from Jacob, suspicious and protective. Was that a lie? It doesn't have to be. Ethan looked at Lydia again, and this time she saw something vulnerable in his expression, something that looked almost like hope. If your mother is willing, I meant every word. If she's not, then we'll find another way to protect your family. But the choice is hers, not mine. We need to talk. Lydia's voice came out steadier than she felt. Children, inside. Now, Mr. Blackridge and I need a moment. The children reluctantly retreated, casting worried looks over their shoulders. Tommy took the hint and disappeared into the barn. Finally, they were alone in the muddy field, the setting sun turning everything gold and impossible. You didn't have to do that, Lydia said. Yes, I did. A marriage proposal out of obligation. Is that what you think this is? Ethan ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. Lydia, I came to this valley to take your home. Instead, I found something I didn't know I was looking for. A woman with more courage than sense. Children who deserve better than what life's given them. A home worth fighting for. And somewhere in the last 4 days of cutting wheat and bleeding through bandages, I realized I didn't want to be the man who destroys this. I wanted to be the man who helps build it. That's not love. That's guilt. Maybe it started as guilt. Maybe it started as curiosity or boredom or temporary insanity, but it's not that anymore. He stepped closer, voice dropping. I wake up thinking about whether you've eaten. I go to sleep calculating harvest yields and market prices. I spent $200 of my own money buying grain futures to hedge against price drops so you'll get fair value for your wheat. I'm not proposing out of obligation, Lydia. I'm proposing because somewhere between your slap and your stubbornness, you made me remember what it's like to care about something more than profit margins. You don't know me. I know you work until your hands bleed. I know you'd walk through fire for your children. I know you make terrible coffee and beautiful biscuits and you hum when you think no one's listening. I know you're the strongest person I've ever met, and you deserve someone in your corner who isn't there out of duty or pity. He held out his hand, palm up, an offering. I'm not promising love. I'm not promising passion or romance or whatever fairy tales call it. But I'm promising partnership. I'm promising to stand with you against deputies and gossips and whatever else comes. I'm promising to be the father your children deserve and the husband you can depend on. Is that enough? Lydia looked at his outstretched hand, at this man who made no sense, who'd somehow become essential over 4 impossible days. Marriage to Blackridge would solve so many problems, the debt, the deputy, the gossip. It would give her children security and respectability. It would save the farm. But it would also tie her to a man she didn't understand, didn't fully trust, didn't love. Though maybe love was a luxury women in her position couldn't afford. Maybe partnership and protection were worth more than romance. Maybe sometimes you married for survival and hoped the rest came later. I have conditions, she said finally. Relief flickered across his face. Name them. This farm stays mine. The deed goes in my name, not yours. I won't trade one man's control for another's. Agreed. I'll have the papers drawn up that way. The children come first, always. Before business, before your reputation, before anything else. I wouldn't want it any other way. And if this doesn't work, if we find we can't make a marriage between us, you walk away clean. No claims on the property, no custody fights, nothing. You leave us as we were. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, and she saw him weighing the terms, calculating the risks. Then he nodded. Fair enough, but I want one condition of my own. Which is? Give it a real chance. Don't just go through the motions waiting for it to fail. Try to build something here with me. Not love necessarily, but trust. Partnership. Maybe even friendship. His voice softened. I've spent 12 years alone, Lydia. I don't want to spend the next 12 married, but just as lonely. If we're going to do this, let's actually do it. She studied his face, searching for deception or hidden motives, and finding only exhaustion and hope, and something that looked like loneliness matching her own. Maybe he was as desperate as she was, just for different reasons. Maybe they were both drowning, and this unlikely marriage was a lifeline they could share. "All right," she said, "we'll try. But Blackridge, Ethan, if we're getting married, you should probably use my name." Ethan. It felt strange on her tongue, intimate in ways that scared her. "If you hurt my children, if you turn out to be anything other than what you're promising right now, I'll do more than slap you. Are we clear?" He smiled, real and warm. "Crystal clear, Mrs. Hale." He caught himself. "Lydia, we should probably use each other's names." "Probably." She took his outstretched hand, his palm rough with fresh blisters against her bandaged fingers. "So we're really doing this, getting married to save a harvest and protect 5 children from a vindictive deputy." "It's not the most romantic proposal in Wyoming history," Ethan admitted. "No, but it might be the most honest one." Lydia squeezed his hand once, then released it. "We should tell the children. They'll have questions. They'll have about 1,000 questions." He turned toward the house where 5 faces were pressed against the windows, watching. "Think they'll be happy?" "I think they're scared and confused and desperate for someone to make them feel safe again. You're offering that. They'd accept a marriage to nearly anyone who could provide it." "But what about you?" Ethan's voice was quiet. "Will you be happy?" Lydia looked at him, this impossible man who'd appeared as her enemy and somehow become her salvation. "I don't know, but I'm willing to find out." They walked toward the house together, not touching but moving in sync, partners already even if the rest was still uncertain. The children met them at the door, anxious and hopeful and terrified all at once. "We're getting married," Lydia said simply. "Mr. Blackridge, Ethan, and I are getting married. Probably this weekend once we finish the harvest. He'll be your stepfather. This will be his home too. Does anyone have problems with that?" Silence. Then Sarah stepped forward, her young face serious. "Will you be good to her? To all of us? Or is this just about money and property?" "I'll be good to all of you," Ethan said. "I promise. This isn't about money. It's about building a family." "We already have a family." Jacob's voice was hard, protective of his father's memory. "We don't need a replacement." "You're right. You don't need a replacement for your father. No one could replace him. But maybe you need someone who can stand beside your mother and help carry what's too heavy for one person alone. That's all I'm offering. Not replacement, just help." Jacob studied him with eyes too old for 9, then slowly nodded. "Okay, but if you hurt Mama, I'll make you sorry." "Fair enough." Ethan held out his hand, and after a hesitation, Jacob shook it. "I'd expect nothing less." One by one, the children accepted the news with varying degrees of enthusiasm. The younger ones seemed simply relieved that the scary deputy wouldn't take them away. Sarah remained watchful but cautiously hopeful. Martha, always the quiet one, whispered, "Will you read to us? Papa used to read to us." Something flickered across Ethan's face, pain or longing or both. "I'd like that very much." The sun had set fully by the time they finished talking, exhaustion dragging at all of them. Ethan moved to leave, to ride back to Milford, but Lydia stopped him. "Stay. There's stew and space in the barn. If we're getting married, you might as well start staying here. Propriety's already shot to hell anyway." "You're sure?" "Nothing about this is sure. But we're committed now. Might as well start acting like it." She managed a tired smile. "Besides, we have 2.5 more days of wheat to cut. Easier if you're here at dawn." 2.5 days, Ethan repeated. "Then the harvest is in, we settle the debt, and we get married. That's quite a week you've planned, Mrs. Hale." "You're the one who proposed in a muddy field to scare off a deputy." "Fair point." He looked at the house, the children peering out, the whole impossible situation. "For what it's worth, I think this is going to work." "Based on what evidence?" "Based on the fact that we're both too stubborn to let it fail." Lydia laughed, surprising herself. That might be the truest thing said all day. That night, Lydia lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a man settling into her barn. The creak of leather as Ethan unsaddled his horse, the rustle of hay as he made a bed, the low murmur of his voice talking to the animals. Sounds that should have felt intrusive but somehow didn't. Sounds that made the homestead feel less empty than it had in 4 months. She was engaged to Ethan Blackridge. The absurdity of it kept circling through her mind like a hawk looking for somewhere to land. A week ago, he'd been her enemy. 3 days ago, she'd been convinced his help was some elaborate trap. Now he was sleeping in her barn and would be her husband by Sunday. "Mama?" Sarah's whisper came from the darkness. "Are you awake?" "Yes, baby." "Are you scared?" Lydia considered lying, offering reassurance she didn't feel, but Sarah deserved honesty. "Terrified. But I've been terrified before and survived it. This is just a different kind of scary." "Do you think he'll be good to us? Really?" "I don't know, but I think he's trying to be, and that counts for something." Lydia reached across the small space between their beds and found Sarah's hand. "We're all figuring this out together, him included. Papa would want us to be happy." The words hit like a physical blow. Lydia squeezed her daughter's hand harder. "Yes, he would. Your papa always wanted us to be safe and happy and together. If marrying Ethan keeps us that way, then that's what we'll do." "Do you think Papa would like him?" Lydia thought about Samuel, steady, hardworking, kind, in ways the world rarely noticed. Would he approve of this hasty marriage to a banker? Or would he understand that sometimes survival required compromises that love alone couldn't afford? "I think your papa would want whatever keeps you safe. Everything else is details." Sarah was quiet for a moment, then said, "I think Mr. Blackridge is lonely. Like really, really lonely. Really." "The way he looks at us sometimes. Like he can't believe we're real. Like he's hungry for something he didn't know he was missing." At 12, her daughter was already too perceptive for comfort. "Maybe he is. Loneliness does strange things to people. Maybe we can help him, the way he's helping us." "Maybe." Lydia closed her eyes, exhaustion finally winning over anxiety. "Now sleep. Tomorrow's another long day." But sleep was elusive. Every time she started to drift, she'd hear movement from the barn and remember that her life had just changed irrevocably. That in less than 3 days she'd be married to a man she'd known for less than a week. That her children would have a stepfather who'd arrived to destroy them and stayed to save them instead. The contradictions made her head ache. Nothing about this made sense, yet here they were, committed to an impossible path because all the sensible paths led to worse places. Dawn came too fast, bringing the 5th day and its demands. Lydia rose to find Ethan already at the pump, washing in the cold water, his shirt hung over the fence. In the gray morning light, she could see scars on his back, old ones, the kind that spoke of violence survived. He turned and caught her staring, and something vulnerable crossed his face before he reached for his shirt. "Sorry, didn't mean to be improper." "It's your home now, too, or will be soon enough." She busied herself with the coffee pot, not looking at him. "Those scars are old history, not worth discussing." His voice had gone flat, closed. "What's the plan for today?" She recognized deflection when she heard it, recognized a man protecting old wounds. She'd respect that boundary for now. "Finish the north section. Start hauling bundled wheat to the barn. We need everything ready to transport by tomorrow afternoon if we're going to make market on Saturday. Saturday's also when we need to get married if we're going to satisfy Cole's scrutiny." "I'm aware." The absurdity hit her again. "We should probably figure out the logistics of that. I assume we're not having a church wedding with flowers and guests. Justice of the peace in Milford. Quick, legal, binding. Unless you want something more." Did she? Once she'd dreamed of a real wedding. White dress, flowers, family gathered, love and hope, and all the trappings. She'd had that with Samuel, small and simple but full of genuine joy. This marriage would be different, practical. A legal contract dressed up as something more. "Quick and legal works," she said. "The children should be there, and Tommy, I suppose, as a witness. I'll arrange it for Saturday morning. That gives us time to get the wheat to market first, settle the debt, then handle the ceremony." Ethan accepted the coffee she handed him, their fingers brushing in the exchange. "We'll need to post the banns today. I'll ride to town after we work the field, file the paperwork." "People will talk." "People are already talking. Let them." He took a sip, made a face. "Your coffee really is terrible." "You're marrying me anyway." "Apparently I'm a masochist." But he smiled when he said it, and something eased between them. This was territory they could navigate, practical discussions, shared tasks, the mechanics of building a life rather than the emotions underneath. The children emerged sleepy and subdued, and they all ate breakfast in near silence, conserving energy for the day ahead. Then they returned to the field, to the wheat that waited, to the deadline that wouldn't bend. Tommy arrived as the sun broke over the mountains, and together the six of them fell into the rhythm that had become familiar: swing, cut, gather, bundle, repeat. The work was meditative in its monotony, leaving too much time for thinking. Lydia found herself watching Ethan between swings, trying to understand this man who would be her husband in 2 days. He worked with quiet efficiency, never complaining, never shirking. He was gentle with the younger children when they brought water, patient with Jacob's competitive attempts to match his pace, respectful of the space between himself and Lydia, while still somehow making his presence felt. He was trying, she realized, trying to fit into their family dynamic without forcing it, trying to be useful without being intrusive. It was more than Samuel's brother had done after the funeral. Daniel had showed up, made noises about duty and family responsibility, then suggested maybe Lydia should consider letting him raise the boys since she obviously couldn't manage alone. He'd left offended when she'd refused, and she hadn't heard from him since. Ethan was nothing like Daniel, nothing like most men she'd known, actually. He occupied space without demanding it, offered help without expecting gratitude, and seemed genuinely confused by the idea that his presence might be anything other than welcome. "You're staring." His voice startled her out of her thoughts. "Sorry, just thinking." About? About how strange this all is. A week ago, I hated you. You didn't know me well enough to hate me. You hated what I represented. He paused in his cutting, wiping sweat from his forehead. "There's a difference. And now? Now you're stuck with me, so hatred seems counterproductive." He grinned, and she found herself almost smiling back. "Though, if my coffee opinions bother you, we can revisit the hatred discussion." "Your coffee opinions are valid. I never claimed to be a good cook." "Then it's fortunate I am. We'll balance each other out." The casual assumption of partnership, of shared domestic life, felt both terrifying and oddly comforting. This was really happening. They were really doing this impossible thing. By midday, they'd finished the north section, the last of the salvageable wheat, 40 acres cut, bundled, and ready for transport. The accomplishment felt surreal, impossible. They'd actually done it. "We need to start hauling," Ethan said, surveying their work. "How many trips to get everything to town?" 4, maybe 5 if we pack the wagon tight. The grain merchant will weigh it and assess quality. If it's good wheat and prices are fair, we should get enough to cover the debt, with some left over. And if prices aren't fair, I'll make them fair. His voice carried an edge that reminded her who he was beyond the man with a scythe. "Marcus Henderson owes me favors. He'll give you honest weight and fair value, or he'll answer to me." "I don't want charity. It's not charity. It's ensuring you're not cheated because you're a woman alone. There's a difference." Ethan turned to face her fully. "Lydia, you've worked yourself half to death to save this place. I'm not letting some merchant undercut you because he thinks he can. That's not charity. That's basic fairness." She wanted to argue, to insist she could handle the merchants herself. But he was right. Women got cheated at market regularly, paid less for the same quality goods, dismissed and patronized and taken advantage of. Having Blackridge's name and influence behind her would change that dynamic completely. "Fine, but I negotiate the price. You just stand there looking intimidating." "I can do that." He smiled. "I've had years of practice." They spent the afternoon loading the wagon, a back-breaking process of hefting heavy bundles and arranging them for maximum efficiency. The children helped where they could, even little Rebecca dragging smaller bundles with fierce determination. By sunset, the first load was ready, tied down and waiting for morning. Ethan rode to Milford to file the marriage paperwork, while Lydia fed her exhausted family and tried not to think about what Saturday would bring. He returned after dark with news that the banns were posted and the justice of the peace would perform the ceremony at 11 o'clock Saturday morning. "It's official," he said, accepting the plate of stew Martha handed him. "We're getting married in 48 hours. Assuming the wheat sells, Lydia sat across from him at the scarred kitchen table. "If we can't clear the debt, we'll clear it. even if I have to pay the difference myself. At her sharp look, he held up his hands. Not charity. Call it a wedding gift or an investment in my future home. Semantics. You're not paying my debts. Then let's make sure the wheat brings enough that I don't have to. He took a bite, chewed thoughtfully. This is good, really good. I thought you said you couldn't cook. I said I made bad coffee. Stew I can manage. She paused. The children want to know what to call you after we're married. Ethan set down his spoon, his expression going carefully neutral. What do they want to call me? I don't know. They're scared of offending their father's memory if they call you Papa. But Mr. Blackridge seems too formal for someone living in the house. Ethan works, or they can figure it out themselves over time. I'm not trying to replace their father. He glanced to where the children were cleaning up, pretending not to listen. I had a stepfather once. He insisted we call him father, erased every trace of my real father from the house, acted like the past didn't exist. It was cruel. I won't do that to them. What happened to your real father? Died when I was 8. Farm accident. His voice was flat, emotionless in that way that meant the emotions were too big to let out. My mother remarried within 6 months. Financial necessity. I understand that now, but at the time it felt like betrayal. Like she was erasing him to make room for someone else. Lydia's throat tightened. Is that what you think I'm doing? No, you're surviving. There's a difference. Ethan met her eyes. You're marrying me to protect your children and save your home. That's not betrayal. That's love taking whatever form it has to. Your children will understand that eventually, even if they don't right now. And your mother? Did you forgive her? She died before I got the chance. Influenza when I was 15. He pushed food around his plate. My stepfather sent me to work in the mines afterward. Said I was old enough to earn my keep. I spent 3 years underground before I saved enough to buy my way out. That's where these came from. He touched his back, indicating the scars she'd glimpsed that morning. Cave in. I was trapped for 18 hours before they dug me out. Decided that day that I'd never be at anyone's mercy again. That I'd make enough money that no one could force me into darkness. The pieces of Ethan Blackridge suddenly made more sense. The wealth, the control, the walls he'd built around himself. He'd survived horrors and climbed out of literal darkness through sheer will. No wonder he was so comfortable with loneliness. Alone was safer than trusting people who might send you back underground. I'm sorry, she said quietly. That's a brutal way to grow up. It made me who I am, for better or worse. He stood carrying his plate to the wash basin. But it also means I understand survival. I understand doing what you have to do, even when it's not what you want. I understand that love is a luxury and survival is necessity. We're building this marriage on necessity, Lydia. That's honest, at least. No pretending we're something we're not. And what are we? 2 people who got dealt bad hands and are trying to play them smart. He dried his hands on the towel. 2 people who could use a partner. 2 people stubborn enough to make this work, even when it's hard. That's more than a lot of marriages start with. He was right, though the pragmatism of it stung. This wasn't a love match. This was a business arrangement with domestic trappings, a merger of resources and mutual need. She'd gone into her first marriage with love and hope and naive belief in happy endings. This time, she was going in clear-eyed about exactly what this was and wasn't. Somehow that felt both better and worse than romantic delusion. The next morning brought chaos and purpose in equal measure. They loaded 3 more wagon trips, each load representing hours of hard work transformed into potential payment. Tommy drove the wagon while Ethan rode alongside, and Lydia and the children stayed to begin the back-breaking work of cleaning up the field, gathering stray stalks and preparing for next year's planting. If there was a next year. If the wheat sold. If the debt cleared. If the marriage worked. So many ifs. They returned in the afternoon with news that sent relief flooding through Lydia's exhausted body. Henderson's offering $450 a ton, Ethan announced. We've got 8 tons at least, maybe 9. That's over $300, possibly closer to $400 depending on final weight. More than enough. More than enough to clear the debt, buy seed for spring, make repairs to the barn, maybe even buy the children new clothes. Lydia sat down hard on the porch steps, suddenly unable to stand. We did it, she whispered. We actually did it. You did it, Ethan corrected. I just helped. No, we did it. Together. She looked up at him, this impossible man who'd become her salvation. Thank you for everything, for the extension, for the help, for sending Tommy, for... Her voice cracked. For all of it. Thank me after the wedding, when you're sure you haven't made a terrible mistake. But his eyes were soft, and when he sat beside her on the steps, the space between them felt less like distance and more like potential. They finished hauling wheat as the sun set on the 6th day, every bundle accounted for, every penny calculated. The debt would be paid with room to spare. The children would stay together. The farm would survive. All that remained was a wedding. That night, Sarah helped Lydia alter her one good dress, the blue cotton she'd worn to Samuel's funeral, now taken in where grief had stolen weight and let out where work had built muscle. It wasn't a wedding dress, but it was clean and mended and would have to do. You look pretty, Mama, Rebecca said, watching the fitting with wide eyes. I look tired, Lydia corrected, studying herself in the small mirror. But Sarah had woven wildflowers into her hair, and the dress fit better than expected, and maybe tired wasn't the same as ugly. Maybe tired just meant surviving. Mr. Blackridge, Ethan, thinks you're pretty, Martha said quietly. He watches you when you're not looking, the way Papa used to. That's different. Papa loved me. Maybe Ethan will too, eventually. Sarah tied off the final alteration. You're both starting from scratch. Maybe that's better than people who marry for love and then get disappointed when it's not enough. When had her children become so wise and so sad? Lydia gathered them close, breathing in the smell of soap and sunshine and childhood that was slipping away too fast. Whatever happens, we're together. That's what matters. We're together, and we're safe, and we're not going anywhere. Everything else will work itself out. She hoped she was telling the truth. Ethan spent the evening in the barn, ostensibly checking harness and equipment, really just staying out of the way while the household prepared for tomorrow. He'd been married once before, briefly, catastrophically. Caroline had been beautiful and ambitious and ultimately faithless, running off with his business partner and half their assets. That betrayal had carved out something essential, left him hollow in ways he'd learned to hide but never quite healed. This marriage to Lydia would be different. No illusions of love, no expectations beyond practical partnership. Maybe that's what made it possible, knowing from the start that this was transaction, not romance, necessity, not desire. Except somewhere in the last week, she'd stopped being just a debtor and become something more. Someone he thought about first thing each morning and last thing at night. Someone whose laugh made him want to hear it again. Someone who fought like hell for what mattered and didn't waste time on what didn't. He wanted this marriage to work. Not just for the children or the farm or his own loneliness. He wanted it to work because Lydia Hale deserved someone in her corner, and he wanted to be that person. Needed to be that person in ways he didn't fully understand and wasn't ready to examine. Tomorrow, they'd stand before justice of the peace and make promises that would bind them legally, if not emotionally. Tomorrow, he'd become a husband again, and a stepfather, and responsible for 5 lives beyond his own. Tomorrow, everything would change. He should be terrified. Instead, he felt something almost like peace. Inside the house, Lydia lay awake for the last time as a widow, listening to her children's breathing, to the sounds of the farm settling around her. Tomorrow, she'd be married. Tomorrow, Ethan Blackridge would have legal rights to her property, her children, her life. She'd spent 4 months fighting to stay independent, and now she was voluntarily giving up that independence to a man she barely knew. But independence without security was just a slower way to lose everything. And partnership, even partnership without love, was better than fighting alone. She thought about Samuel, about the marriage they'd built on genuine affection and shared dreams. She'd loved him deeply, missed him painfully. But loving him hadn't saved him from dying. Loving him hadn't paid the debts or harvested the wheat or kept the children safe from deputies who saw vulnerability and moved to exploit it. Love wasn't enough. Sometimes survival required more than love, required compromise and pragmatism, and marriages built on necessity instead of romance. I'm sorry, she whispered to Samuel's memory. I'm sorry this isn't what we planned, but I think you'd understand. I think you'd want me to do whatever keeps them safe. Even this." Outside, an owl called in the darkness. The wheat field lay empty now, stubble where golden stalks had stood. Harvest was over. Tomorrow would bring new beginnings. A marriage, a debt paid, a future that looked different than anything she'd imagined. But different wasn't always worse. Sometimes different was just what survival looked like when you were strong enough to reach for it. Lydia closed her eyes and tried to sleep, tried to silence the fears and questions and doubts that circled like crows waiting for something to die. Tomorrow would come whether she was ready or not. Tomorrow she'd stand beside Ethan Blackridge and promise things she wasn't sure she could deliver. Tomorrow she'd become someone's wife again, someone's partner, someone's responsibility and refuge all at once. Tomorrow she'd find out if impossible things stayed impossible or transformed into something real enough to build a life on. Saturday morning arrived draped in autumn gold, the kind of perfect September day that made promises feel possible. Lydia woke before dawn to find her hands steady for the first time in a week. Today she would marry a man she'd known for 7 days. Today she would pay a debt that had nearly destroyed her. Today everything would change, and for once the change felt like moving forward instead of just surviving the fall. The children were already awake, nervous energy filling the small house. Sarah had pressed Lydia's blue dress and laid it carefully across the bed. Martha had picked more wildflowers, weaving them into a crown that looked almost bridal. Even Jacob, who'd been most resistant to the marriage, had polished his shoes and combed his hair without being asked. "Everyone ready?" Lydia asked, though it wasn't really a question. Ready or not, they were doing this. "Is Ethan nervous?" Rebecca asked, peering out the window toward the barn where lamplight showed he was already awake. "Probably. Getting married is scary for everyone. Even when you don't love each other?" The question was innocent, but it cut deep. Lydia knelt down to Rebecca's level, smoothing hair from her daughter's face. "Love isn't always where you start, baby. Sometimes it's where you end up if you're patient and kind to each other. Ethan and I are starting with respect and partnership. That's a good foundation. The rest will come or it won't, but either way we'll be all right." "I hope it comes," Rebecca whispered. "You deserve to be happy again." "So do you. So do all of us." Lydia kissed her forehead and stood. "Now help me with this dress before I lose my nerve entirely." By the time the sun cleared the mountains, the family was ready. Lydia wore her blue dress with the wildflower crown, looking more like a frontier bride than she'd expected. The children were scrubbed and dressed in their Sunday clothes, faces nervous but hopeful. Tommy had cleaned up remarkably well, his wild hair tamed and his best shirt only slightly wrinkled. Ethan emerged from the barn and stopped dead at the sight of her. For a long moment he just stared, and Lydia felt heat rise in her cheeks. "You look beautiful," he said finally, voice rough. "I look clean. There's a difference." "I'm going to disagree." He dressed in a proper suit, dark and severe, and the transformation from field worker back to banker was startling. This was the man who'd first ridden into her valley, powerful, controlled, intimidating. Except now she knew what lay beneath the expensive clothes and careful composure. Now she'd seen him bleeding through bandages and laughing with her children and sleeping in hay because he'd chosen to stand with them. "You clean up well yourself," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Ready to make a terrible decision?" "The best terrible decision I've ever made." He offered his arm. "Shall we?" They loaded into the wagon, the whole impossible family plus Tommy, and headed toward Milford. The road was rough, the journey slow, and the silence heavy with unspoken thoughts. Lydia found herself watching Ethan's profile as he drove, trying to reconcile all the versions of him she'd seen this week. The cold banker, the generous helper, the lonely man who'd survived being buried alive, the patient almost stepfather who read bedtime stories and didn't insist on replacing anyone's memory. "You're staring again," he said without looking at her. "I'm trying to figure out who I'm marrying." "Let me know when you find out. I'm still working on that myself." He glanced at her then, something vulnerable in his expression. "Lydia, if you want to back out, we can. I'll find another way to deal with Cole. You don't have to do this if you're not sure." "I'm terrified." "That's not the same as not being sure." She took a breath. "Are you having second thoughts?" "About 100, but none of them are about wanting to do this. They're all about whether I deserve to." His hands tightened on the reins. You're getting a man with more scars than sense, and a history of trusting the wrong people. That's not much of a bargain. I'm getting a man who worked himself bloody to save my home when he could have just taken it. A man who sees my children as people worth protecting instead of burdens to be managed. A man who makes terrible coffee opinions but excellent sense when it matters. She found his hand on the seat between them and squeezed it. That seems like a decent bargain to me. He laced his fingers through hers, and they rode the rest of the way in silence, hands joined, heading toward a future neither could predict, but both were willing to try. Milford appeared around the final bend, a thriving railroad town that smelled of livestock and coal smoke and commerce. The grain merchant's scales stood at the center of town, and Marcus Henderson himself waited there, his expression somewhere between curious and concerned. Black Ridge. Mrs. Hale. He nodded to them both. Brought the final load? Final weight and final payment, Ethan said, climbing down. Let's settle this before the wedding. Wedding? Henderson's eyebrows shot up. The rumors are true, then? Rumors are usually true. That's why they spread. Ethan helped Lydia down from the wagon, his hand lingering at her waist. Can we proceed? The weighing took an hour. Bundles hoisted onto the massive scales, weight recorded, quality assessed. Henderson was thorough but fair, and when the final tally came in, Lydia's knees nearly buckled. 8 tons, 900 pounds. At $450 per ton, that meant nearly $400. $400. Enough to pay the debt twice over with money left for winter supplies and spring seed. I'll draw up the payment now, Henderson said. You want cash or bank draft? Cash for $200, draft for the rest, Ethan said before Lydia could answer. The $200 goes directly to settling her loan. The draft goes in Mrs. Hale's name for her operating expenses. Actually, it'll be Mrs. Blackridge in about an hour, Lydia corrected, and saying it out loud made it real in ways it hadn't been before. Mrs. Blackridge. She was about to become Mrs. Blackridge. Henderson disappeared into his office while they waited, and Lydia found herself shaking. $400, I can't believe it. You earned every penny. Ethan stayed close, protective, without being possessive. Your work, your wheat, your determination. This is your victory. Our victory? I couldn't have done it without you. You'd have found a way. You're too stubborn not to. But he smiled when he said it, and the warmth in his eyes made something flutter in her chest that felt dangerously close to affection. Henderson returned with cash and papers, and Ethan counted out $200 in bills that felt like salvation in paper form. This clears the Hale debt in full. I want a receipt stating the loan is satisfied and the property lien released. Of course, Henderson wrote quickly, signed with a flourish, and handed over the receipt. Congratulations, Mrs. Hale. You're officially debt-free. Debt-free. The words felt impossible. Lydia clutched the receipt like it might disappear, proof that she'd done the impossible thing, that her home was truly hers now, that no one could take it away. Thank you, she whispered to Ethan, for the chance, for believing I could do it. I never doubted you'd succeed. I just doubted I'd be smart enough to help instead of standing in your way. He glanced at the church clock tower. We have 30 minutes before the ceremony. Should we? Wait. A familiar voice cut through the moment. Deputy Cole emerged from the sheriff's office, his expression smug. Before anyone goes anywhere, I have questions about this convenient engagement. Ice flooded Lydia's veins. We paid the debt. We're getting married. What more do you want? Proof this isn't fraud. Proof you're not making a mockery of marriage just to avoid my investigation. Cole looked between them with open skepticism. Because, from where I stand, this looks like two people staging a relationship to keep children in an unsafe home. The only unsafe thing here is your abuse of authority, Ethan said, his voice deadly calm. Mrs. Hale's home is clean, her children are healthy, and her circumstances are stable. Your investigation is harassment masquerading as civic duty, and we both know it. Then you won't mind proving your engagement is genuine, public displays of affection, testimony from witnesses, evidence this isn't a business arrangement. What we won't mind is telling Judge Morrison about your vendetta against widows who won't sell you their land cheaply. Ethan stepped forward, and something in his posture made Cole step back. You're working for Martha Gaines, aren't you? She wants the Hale property to expand her boarding house, and you're using county authority to pressure a vulnerable woman into selling. That's corruption, Cole. That's the kind of thing that gets deputies stripped of their badges. You can't prove. I can prove whatever I need to prove. I have resources you can't imagine and connections that make territorial governors nervous. So here's what's going to happen. Ethan's voice dropped lower, more dangerous. You're going to walk away. You're going to close your investigation. You're going to tell Martha Gaines that the Hale property isn't available at any price. And you're going to pray I don't decide to look too closely at your financial records, because I suspect we'd find some very interesting discrepancies. Cole's face had gone white. You're threatening a lawman. I'm promising a corrupt deputy that actions have consequences. There's a difference. Ethan pulled papers from his vest. These are signed statements from 3 families you've harassed with similar tactics, all willing to testify if needed. Walk away, Cole, while you still can. For a long moment, the deputy looked like he might push back. Then survival instinct won over pride. This isn't over, Blackridge. Yes, it is. You just don't know it yet. Ethan watched Cole retreat toward his horse, then turned to Lydia. Sorry, should have handled that with more diplomacy. That was perfect. She was shaking, but with relief now instead of fear. How did you... Those statements... I spent 3 evenings in town talking to people after I finished in your fields. Cole's been running this scheme for 2 years. You're just the first person who fought back hard enough to make him nervous. Ethan offered his arm again. Now, if there are no more interruptions, I believe we have a wedding to attend. The Justice of the Peace's office was small and spare, smelling of paper and dust and old law books. Justice Thornton was elderly and kind, his hands shaking slightly as he opened his book of ceremonies. The children clustered close. Tommy stood awkward but supportive, and Lydia found herself standing before this near stranger she was about to marry, feeling the weight of impossibility settling around them like a blessing or a curse. She wasn't sure which. Dearly beloved, Thornton began, but Ethan interrupted. Can we skip the preamble? We're both clear on what we're doing here. The justice blinked. It's traditional. We're not a traditional couple. Just the vows, please. Thornton looked flustered but flipped pages. Very well. Ethan Blackridge, do you take Lydia Hale to be your lawfully wedded wife to have and to hold, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? Ethan turned to face Lydia fully, his eyes serious. I do. And I promise to honor that vow, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Lydia Hale, do you take Ethan Blackridge to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? Lydia looked at this man who'd saved her family in more ways than one, who'd shown up when he could have stayed away, who was choosing them every day despite having every reason not to. I do. And I promise to be a partner worth having, even when I'm stubborn and difficult. You're always stubborn and difficult, Ethan said, but he was smiling. That's not a conditional promise. Then I promise to try. That's the best I can offer. It's enough. He took her hands, and she noticed his were trembling slightly. He was nervous. This powerful, controlled man was actually nervous about marrying her. More than enough. By the power vested in me by Wyoming territory, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride. The moment stretched awkward and uncertain. They'd never kissed, never even held hands before today except that one moment in the wagon. This would be their first kiss, and it was happening in front of 5 children, a teenage farmhand, and an elderly justice of the peace. Ethan leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull back if she wanted to. Lydia met him halfway, and their lips touched in something tentative and brief and surprisingly warm. Not passionate, they weren't there yet, but genuine. A promise made physical, a beginning. When they pulled apart, Rebecca was crying happy tears, and Sarah was smiling, and even Jacob looked cautiously pleased. Tommy clapped too loudly in the small space, and Justice Thornton was already filling out the marriage certificate with shaking hands. Congratulations, he said, handing over the document. May your marriage be blessed with happiness and prosperity. We'll settle for not killing each other, Ethan said, making the old man laugh. Outside, the afternoon sun turned everything golden. Mrs. Lydia Blackridge, the name felt foreign and familiar all at once, stood on the courthouse steps with her new husband and her children and felt something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. Real, tangible hope that life might actually be more than just survival. "What now?" Sarah asked. "Do we go home?" "We go home," Ethan confirmed. "We celebrate with whatever passes for a wedding feast. And tomorrow, we start figuring out how to be a family." "We already are a family," Martha said quietly. "We've been one all week. We're just making it official now." Smart girl, too smart. But she was right. Somewhere between wheat fields and bleeding hands and shared exhaustion, they'd become something that looked like family. Now they just had to figure out how to make it last beyond crisis and necessity. The ride home was different than the journey out. Lighter, somehow, despite the massive changes they'd just committed to. The children chattered about the ceremony, about Deputy Cole's retreat, about what they'd cook for dinner. Ethan drove with Lydia pressed against his side on the wagon seat, and she let herself lean into his warmth, let herself imagine that maybe this impossible thing could actually work. "Regrets yet?" she asked quietly, under the cover of the children's noise. "Not even one. You? Ask me in a year." "Fair enough." His arm came around her shoulders, casual and careful at the same time. "Thank you for taking a chance on this. On me. Thank you for showing up, for staying, for fighting when you could have just taken what the law said was yours." She looked up at him. "Why did you? Really?" Ethan was quiet for a long moment, the wagon creaking beneath them, the mountains rising blue in the distance. "Because 12 years ago, someone took everything from me. My business, my savings, my faith in people. And I swore I'd never be vulnerable again, never let anyone close enough to hurt me. I built walls so high that nothing could get through, including anything good." He glanced down at her. "Then you slapped me in a dusty yard and told me I'd have to kill you first, and something cracked. I saw what I'd become. The man who breaks people because I'm too scared to risk being broken again. I didn't like it, so I made a different choice. You chose us. I chose to try being human again instead of just being safe." He pulled her closer. "You and those children, you fight for each other like it's the only thing that matters. Because it is. And I wanted to be part of something that mattered instead of just something that was profitable. Is that stupid? Probably. But it's the best kind of stupid." Lydia rested her head against his shoulder, feeling exhaustion and relief and something that might be contentment. "We're going to make mistakes, you know, probably spectacular ones. Undoubtedly. But we'll make them together, and we'll figure it out as we go." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, casual as breathing. "That's what partners do." Partners. Not lovers, not yet. But partners was a good place to start. The homestead appeared around the final bend, and Lydia felt tears prick her eyes. Home. Still hers, still theirs. The little house with its patched roof, the leaning barn, the field now empty but full of promise for spring. They'd saved it. Against impossible odds, they'd actually saved it. "Welcome home, Mrs. Blackridge," Ethan said as he pulled the wagon to a stop. "Welcome home, Mr. Blackridge," she echoed, and the name felt less foreign now, more like possibility than prison. They unloaded children and supplies, and Martha immediately started organizing a celebration meal, while Sarah gathered eggs and Jacob checked on the animals with Tommy. The little ones danced around the yard, giddy with relief that their world wasn't ending after all. And Ethan stood in the center of it all, looking slightly overwhelmed but genuinely happy. "This is what you signed up for," Lydia said, coming to stand beside him. "Chaos and noise and children everywhere? Still think it was a good decision?" "Ask me when I'm not exhausted and can think straight." But he was smiling. "They're good kids. You've done well with them." "They've done well despite me. I'm just trying to keep up." She hesitated, then said, "You don't have to sleep in the barn anymore. We're married. People will expect. I'll take the small room off the kitchen. Give everyone time to adjust before we share space too intimately." He caught her expression. "Unless you want me to." "No, the small room is good. Smart. We're building this slowly, remember?" Relief and something else, disappointment maybe, flickered through her. "Thank you for understanding. We're partners before we're anything else. That means respecting boundaries until we're both ready to renegotiate them. Ethan touched her cheek briefly. No rush, Lydia. We have time to figure this out. That evening, they gathered around the kitchen table for a wedding feast cobbled together from what they had: fresh bread, eggs scrambled with wild onions, the last of summer's tomatoes, strong coffee that Ethan still grimaced at but drank anyway. It wasn't fancy, but it was theirs, and that mattered more than elegance. To Mama and Ethan, Sarah said, raising her water glass in a toast. May you be happy together. To family, Ethan countered, raising his own glass. However it's assembled. They drank and ate, and slowly the exhaustion of the past week caught up with all of them. The little ones fell asleep at the table, and the older children weren't far behind. Ethan carried Rebecca to bed while Lydia guided the others, and they moved through the evening routines like a family that had been together years instead of days. When the children were finally settled, Lydia and Ethan stood in the kitchen, suddenly alone and suddenly uncertain how to navigate this new configuration. I should probably turn in, Ethan said. Early morning tomorrow. Doing what? The harvest is in, the debt is paid, we can actually rest. I was thinking we could start repairs on the barn. Then maybe I should ride to my office, start transferring some of my business here so I'm not constantly traveling. If I'm living here, I should actually be here. He paused. Unless you want me to maintain the office in Milford, keep that separation? No, this is your home now. You should be here. Lydia moved closer. Thank you. For today. For all of it. For choosing us when you could have chosen so many easier paths. Easier isn't always better. He touched her face again, and this time his hand lingered. You're an extraordinary woman, Lydia Blackridge. I'm lucky to have you. Ask me again when I'm being stubborn about something. Especially then. He leaned in and kissed her forehead. Good night, wife. Good night, husband. He retreated to the small room while Lydia climbed the stairs to the bedroom she'd shared with Samuel that she now occupied alone. The bed felt too empty, but also peaceful. A space to breathe and adjust to the massive changes this week had brought. She was married. Again. To a man she barely knew but was starting to understand. To a partner who'd proven himself in ways that mattered. To someone who'd chosen her family when he could have destroyed it. It wasn't the love match she'd had with Samuel, but maybe it was something else. Something built on stronger foundations than romance. Respect, partnership, shared purpose. Those things lasted when passion faded. Those things built marriages that survived the hard years. At least that's what she told herself as she drifted toward sleep, exhausted and hopeful and terrified all at once. In the small room below, Ethan lay awake on a bed too short for his frame and listened to his new family settling around him. Children breathing in sleep. Lydia moving quietly overhead. The house creaking with wind and the weight of lives being lived within its walls. He'd spent 12 years alone, convinced that safety meant solitude. Now he was surrounded by people who needed him, who'd let him be part of their lives, who'd taken a chance on a man too damaged to believe in second chances. He should be terrified. Instead, he felt something he'd almost forgotten: peace. The kind that came from being exactly where you belonged, even if where you belonged was nowhere you'd planned to be. Weeks turned into months, and the impossible marriage slowly became real. Ethan threw himself into repairing the homestead, fixing everything Samuel's death had left undone. The barn got a new roof, the corral got proper fencing, the house got windows that actually closed tight, and a stove that didn't smoke. He worked like a man possessed, and Lydia eventually realized he was building a home, building trust, building a foundation for whatever they might become. They learned each other's rhythms. Ethan made breakfast because Lydia couldn't manage mornings. Lydia handled the books because numbers made Ethan's eyes cross with boredom. He was patient with the children's grief and confusion. She was patient with his occasional retreats into emotional distance when memories ambushed him. They weren't lovers yet, but they were becoming friends, and friendship felt like a good foundation for whatever came next. Winter came early that year, blanketing the valley in snow that turned everything quiet and clean. They gathered around the fire in the evenings, Ethan reading aloud while Lydia mended and the children did lessons, and the small house felt full in ways that had nothing to do with physical space. Tell us about when you were little, Rebecca asked one night, curled against Ethan's side like she'd been born there. I was never little. I came into the world fully grown and extremely grumpy. He smiled at her giggle. But when I was your age, I had a dog named Bear who was bigger than most horses. He used to let me ride him around the farmyard like I was some kind of cavalry officer. What happened to Bear? Martha asked. He got old, lived a long, good life, and died peaceful in his sleep. That's the best any of us can hope for. Ethan glanced at Lydia, who was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. What? Nothing. You're just good with them. Natural. They're easy to be good with. They're good kids. He tugged Rebecca's braid gently. Even when they're asking impossible questions about ancient history. You're not ancient, Sarah protested. You're barely older than Mama. I'm 34 and I feel about 60 after this week's work. That barn roof tried to kill me 3 times. But he was smiling and the children were laughing, and Lydia felt something warm unfold in her chest. This was family. Not the family she'd planned, not the family she'd expected, but family nonetheless. Built from necessity and stubbornness, and 2 people willing to try something impossible until it became real. That night, after the children were asleep, Ethan found Lydia in the kitchen making her terrible coffee. Can I ask you something? You're my husband. You can ask me anything. Are you happy? Really happy? Or are you just making the best of a difficult situation? He leaned against the counter, vulnerable in ways he rarely allowed. Because if this is just survival for you, I need to know. I need to know if there's any chance this becomes more than a business arrangement. Lydia turned to face him fully, this man who'd become essential without her noticing. A month ago, I would have said survival was enough. That partnership without love was all I could expect. But somewhere between harvest and now, you've become more than just my husband on paper. You're someone I look forward to seeing each morning, someone whose opinion matters, someone who makes me laugh when I'm tired and holds me together when I'm falling apart. She stepped closer. I don't know if that's love yet, but it's something that could become love if we're patient with it. Patient is good. I can do patient. He reached for her hand. I'm falling for you, Lydia. Slowly, carefully, but definitely falling. For you and those children, and this whole chaotic life we're building. I just needed you to know that this isn't obligation for me anymore. It's choice. Every day I'm choosing this, choosing you. I'm choosing you too, she whispered. I have been for a while now. I was just scared to admit it. He kissed her then, properly this time. Not the tentative wedding kiss, but something deeper and more certain. A kiss that tasted like promise and possibility, and the slow burn of affection becoming more. When they pulled apart, they were both breathing hard, and Lydia felt something shift between them, a door opening to rooms they hadn't yet explored. Maybe, she said carefully, you shouldn't sleep in the small room anymore. Maybe, he agreed. I shouldn't. That night, Ethan moved his few belongings upstairs, and they navigated the awkward intimacy of sharing space for the first time. It wasn't perfect. They were still learning each other, still finding rhythms, but it was real and honest and full of possibility. They held each other in the darkness and talked until sleep claimed them, and when Lydia woke at dawn, she found herself wrapped around him like he was an anchor keeping her from drifting away. This was what marriage was supposed to be, not constant passion or dramatic declarations, but steady presence and quiet affection and someone warm beside you in the dark. Spring came, and with it came planting season. They worked the fields together, Ethan and Lydia side by side, turning earth and planting seed and betting on the future. The children helped where they could, stronger now, less haunted by grief. Jacob had started calling Ethan Pa without being asked, and it made something crack open in Ethan's chest every time. Deputy Cole had been quietly removed from his position after an investigation into his finances revealed exactly what Ethan had suspected. Martha Gaines had left town shortly after, her schemes exposed and her reputation ruined. The valley was peaceful, and the Blackridge family thrived in that peace. One evening in late May, as sunset painted the mountains gold and the new wheat was just beginning to show green in the fields, Ethan found Lydia sitting on the porch, watching their children play in the yard. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, settling beside her. "I was thinking about how strange life is. How a year ago I was terrified and alone and certain we'd lose everything. How you rode into that valley to take our home and instead ended up saving it, saving us. She leaned into his side. How the worst day of my life led somehow to this. Having second thoughts about marrying the banker who tried to foreclose on you? Not even one. She turned to kiss him, easy and familiar now. You're the best terrible decision I ever made, Ethan Blackridge. You're the debt I never knew I needed to pay. He wrapped his arms around her. The one that brought me home. In the yard, 5 children played without worry or fear, their laughter rising like prayer into the evening air. Inside the house, dinner waited, and beds were made, and life was simply, miraculously ordinary. The wheat grew green in fields worked by hands that had learned to bleed together. The barn stood straight with a roof that wouldn't leak come winter. The debt was paid, the family was whole, and 2 people who'd started as adversaries had become partners and then something more. Love, as it turned out, wasn't where they'd started. But it was exactly where they'd ended up, slowly, carefully, built on foundations of respect and partnership and the courage to try impossible things until they became real. Ethan had ridden into Hale Valley to collect a debt. Instead, he'd found a home, a family, and a second chance at becoming the man he'd always meant to be before loss had taught him to build walls instead of bridges. And Lydia, who'd stood barefoot in the dirt and refused to surrender, had discovered that sometimes the person you think is your enemy is actually your salvation, wearing an unexpected face. They stayed on that porch until the stars came out, watching their children play and their wheat grow and their impossible life unfold exactly as it was meant to, messy and beautiful and real. A debt paid in full. Not with money, but with courage, with stubbornness, with the slow alchemy that turns 2 broken people into something whole. The valley held them close, and they held each other, and the future stretched before them full of promise and possibility, and the quiet certainty that they'd fight for this life, this family, this love, for as long as breath remained in their bodies. Because that's what partners did. That's what families did. That's what love looked like when it was built on truth instead of illusion, steady, strong, and worth every impossible moment it took to bring it into being.